Hi folks, welcome back to our Aussie Citizenship Test preparation. This is part 3. So if you haven't done it yet, go and check out the first 2. The links are in the description below, together with a link to a Quizlet set for you to learn useful vocabulary for this test. Quizlet is an online platform where you can create and play with word lists to learn and memorize them. It's pretty cool and it's free, so I suggest you give it a go. Alright, so part 3 is often considered the most difficult one because it's a bit long and it talks about government and law in Australia. Not the most interesting topics around, I know, but don't worry, we'll try to make it as easy as possible for you, and I'm sure you'll know all about it by the end of the video. So first thing to understand is that because Australia is a parliamentary democracy, we, the people, have a say in running the country, and this happens through voting. Voting is anonymous, but it is also compulsory in Australia, meaning that no one will know who you voted for, but also you have to do it. Otherwise, you may have to pay a fine. When you become Australian, you will have to vote for federal, state and territory elections, so you'd better keep up to date with politics to know who to vote for. The Australian Electoral Commission, AEC, is responsible for conducting federal elections and referendums, and they're independent of the government, so no one can influence their decisions. If you have any concerns or suggestions about government policies, you can contact your elected representative. They're there to represent you and your interests. Alright, now a bit of history. Let's talk about how Australia established its system of government. You already know that Australia became a unified country on the 1st of January 1901. But what we haven't mentioned yet is that this is also when the Australian Constitution came into effect. The Australian Constitution was the legal document that described the basic rules for the government of Australia, and it also established the Parliament of the Commonwealth of Australia, consisting of a House of Representatives and a Senate, and the High Court of Australia, which has the ultimate power to apply and interpret the laws of Australia. The Australian people can change the Australian Constitution by voting in a referendum. In 1967, more than 90% of Australians voted yes to allow Aboriginal peoples to be counted in the census. In a referendum, there needs to be a double majority for the Australian Constitution to be changed. That is both the majority of voters in a majority of states and a majority of voters across the nation must vote for the change. In this section, we look at the different powers of the government. The Australian Constitution divides the power of the government into 3 parts: the legislative, executive, and judicial powers. This is to make sure that no one person or group has all the power. Let's break down what each of these powers do. The legislative power is the power to make laws, and this is done by the Parliament. The Parliament is made up of representatives who are elected by the people of Australia, so the people have a say in the laws that are made. Next up is the executive power, which is the power to put the laws into practice. The Prime Minister, Australian government ministers, and the Governor-General make up the executive. Ministers are responsible for government departments like health, education, etc. Lastly, the judicial power is held by judges who have the power to interpret and apply the law. They are independent of the Parliament and the government. So who are the most powerful people in Australia? Well, at the top, there would be Australia's head of state, His Majesty King Charles III. See, Australia is a constitutional monarchy, which means that the King is Australia's head of state, but he has to act in accordance with the Constitution. As the King doesn't live in Australia, his powers are delegated to the Governor-General, who he appoints on advice from the Australian Prime Minister. So who is this Governor-General, and what does he do? Well, first thing to note is that he is not part of the government and must remain neutral. The Governor-General has a few important roles, which include signing all bills passed by the Australian Parliament into law and performing ceremonial duties. But the most interesting fact about the Governor-General is that he has special powers, known as reserve powers, that can only be used in specific circumstances. I know, sounds really intriguing, doesn't it? Now, let's take a look at some of Australia's leaders. Besides the head of state and Governor General that we have talked about, there are also government ministers, who are members of parliament chosen by the Prime Minister to be responsible for an area of government. Then we have MPs, or members of parliament, who are the people's representatives in the Australian or state parliament. Lastly, we have the senators, who are elected representatives of a state or territory in the Australian Parliament. Let's talk about how Australia is governed now. We will look at this from a federal perspective first, meaning concerning all of Australia, to then move on to state and territory and then local government, from bigger to smaller. So for the big picture, we have the Australian government, which is also called the Federal or Commonwealth Government. The government is made up of members of the Australian Parliament, which has two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Let's have a look at these in more detail. The House of Representatives, which is also known as the lower house or the People's House, is made up of over 150 members who represent the people in their area. The areas that are represented by the same member of Parliament are called electorate. So what responsibilities does the House of Representatives have? Well, it is responsible for considering, debating and voting on proposals for new laws or changes to the laws, and discussing matters of national importance. The other Parliament House is the Senate, which is sometimes called the Upper House, the House of Review, or the States House. All states are equally represented in the Senate, regardless of their size or population, and there are a total of 76 senators. Each state elects 12 senators, and the Australian Capital Territory and Northern Territory elects 2 senators each. The Senate, similarly to the House of Representatives, also considers, debates and votes on new laws or changes to the laws and discusses matters of national importance. Now, let's go one step down and talk about state and territory government. As I'm sure you remember, there are 6 states and 2 territories in Australia. Each state government has its own parliament and constitution. The leader of a state government is the Premier, and the leader of a territory government is the Chief Minister. State governments operate in a similar way to the Australian government, and each state has a governor who represents the King of Australia. In the Northern Territory, this figure is called administrator instead of governor, but has a similar role and responsibilities and is appointed by the Governor General. Whew. Okay, last level of government. The smallest scale one is the local government. The states and the Northern Territory are divided into local government areas, which may be called cities, shires, towns, or municipalities. Each area has its own local council, which is responsible for planning and delivering services to the local community. Citizens in each local government area vote to elect their local councillors. Now, just to put everything into perspective, let me show you what these 3 levels of government do. Because as we said, we go from the bigger scale of the federal government down to state and territory, and then down to local. Also, their responsibilities will be based on this scale. Let me give you some examples. See, because the federal or Australian government is the broader kind of government, it is responsible for nationwide matters such as taxation, national economic management, immigration, and citizenship. The state and territory governments are on a smaller scale, and so they can take care of something a bit more specific, such as hospitals and health services, schools, roads, and public transport. Finally, we have local governments, which are responsible for even more specific matters, such as street signs, parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, etc. They also take care of food and meat inspection, noise control, rubbish collection, and also some childcare and aged care issues, just to name a few. All right, we're finally done with this section, guys. I know it was tough, but I promise it's all going to be downhill from now. All right, let's move on to political parties now. A good place to start is to understand what exactly a political party is. A political party is basically a group of people who share similar ideas about how a country should be governed. They work together to have the party's ideas turned into laws. In Australia, we have four main political parties: the Liberal Party of Australia, the Australian Labor Party, the Nationals, and the Australian Greens. In Australia, most parliamentarians belong to political parties, but also regular people like me and you. Remember, we talked about freedom of expression and association. Well, this gives us the right to join any political party if we want to. Now, we said that most parliamentarians belong to political parties, but some don't, and these are called independents. Next thing for us to discuss is how the Australian government is formed, which basically happens every time we have a new Prime Minister. This process starts with federal elections, which is when all people in Australia go to vote to choose their representatives. Whichever party has the most people in the House of Representatives wins the election and becomes the Australian government, with the leader of this party becoming the leader of the Australian government, also known as the Prime Minister or PM. After the federal election, the party or coalition of parties with the second largest number of members in the House of Representatives forms the opposition. Its leader is called the Leader of the Opposition. So guys, we're coming to the end of part 3, so we're almost done. In this section, we're going to talk about Australian laws, how they are made, and how the government makes sure the citizens respect them. So let's start with who makes our laws, which is the Australian Parliament, as we mentioned before. If a member of the Australian Parliament proposes to introduce a new law or change to an existing one, this proposal is called a bill. Next, the two houses of the Australian government, the House of Representatives and the Senate, consider, debate and vote on whether they agree with the bill. If the majority of members in each house agree to the bill, it goes to the Governor-General, who signs it to transform it into law. Now, this act is called royal assent. In Australia, besides these federal laws, there are also state or territory laws, and they are made following the same procedure, just on a smaller scale. All right, now that we know how laws are made, let's see how the government makes sure that all citizens obey or respect them. The main bodies involved in their tasks are the ones making up our legal system. So the courts with their judges, magistrates and juries, and then of course the police. Let's look at each of these bodies in more detail. So first up, the courts. The courts in Australia are independent, which means that they are free from influence or control by any outside parties. When someone is suspected of breaking the law, the court will look at the evidence and decide whether or not they are guilty. The judge or magistrate is the highest authority in the court, and they are completely independent. No one can tell them what to decide, not even the government. And if the government disagrees with their decisions, they can't fire them or punish them in any way whatsoever. So let's talk about juries. In Australia, people are considered innocent until proven guilty, and everyone has the right to be represented by a lawyer in court. In some cases, the court will use a jury to decide whether or not someone is guilty. The jury is made up of ordinary Australian citizens who are randomly chosen from the general population. The judge explains the law to the jury, and if they find someone guilty in a criminal trial, the judge decides the penalty. Next, let's talk about the police. The police maintain peace and order in the community and protect life and property. They are independent of the government, and if they believe that someone has broken the law, they can arrest them and bring them before a court of law. The police may present evidence in the court, but the court is the body that ultimately decides whether or not somebody is guilty. In Australia, each state and the Northern Territory have their own police forces that deal with crimes under state and territory laws, and we also have a national police force called the Australian Federal Police, AFP. So the AFP investigates crimes against federal laws, such as drug trafficking, crimes against national security, and crimes against the environment. They are also responsible for general police work in the Australian Capital Territory. Something important for you to know is that the police and the community have a good relationship in Australia. If you ever need to report a crime or ask for help, you can contact your local police. But it's important to remember that bribery, which is offering money to police to do you a favour, is a serious crime in Australia. This is illegal and it might get you in big, big trouble. All right, last section for today is criminal offences in Australia. First things first, it's super important to be familiar with the laws in Australia. Even if you're not a citizen, if you break a law that you didn't know about, you can still be charged. Basically, not knowing the law is no excuse for committing a crime. Some of the most serious crimes in Australia include murder, assault, sexual assault, violence against people or property, armed robbery or theft, having sexual relations with children, dangerous driving, possession of illegal drugs, and fraud. A crime that we take very seriously in Australia is domestic and family violence. This includes aggressive or harming behaviour towards your partner or family member. Some examples of such behaviour are hitting, isolating a family member, or threatening their children. If you or someone you know is in danger, please don't hesitate to contact the police. You can also find more information on respect and support services at respect.gov.au and 1800-respect.org.au. And last on our list are traffic offences. In Australia, road and traffic rules are controlled by state and territory governments. People can be fined or sent to prison for breaking traffic laws. To drive in a car in Australia, you must have a local driver's licence and the car must be registered. And remember, traffic laws don't apply only to the driver. Everybody travelling in the car must wear a seatbelt and babies and young children must be in an approved car seat. Traffic laws are very strict in Australia. It's illegal to drive if you are above the blood alcohol limit or under the effect of drugs, and this is one that you may not know about yet. It is also against the law to use your phone while driving, even if you're just checking directions. There are already cameras checking for phone usages in major cities, and they are installing more and more, so please be careful. All right, guys, we're all done for today. I know this was a tough one. Feel free to go back and rewatch previous sections if you think there's something that was a bit confusing to you. It was a lot of information to take in, I get it. In the video description below, you will find a test to practice what you have learned today. So make sure you have a go at it before you take your official test. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you very, very soon for our last Aussie citizenship video on part 4, Australian values. Cheers, guys.